Hi, I am printing here and I'm going to talk you through what I'm up to. I'm making a Japanese woodblock print and it's called Rhubarb Sky Hawnby. It's a picture of North Yorkshire. So here I am damping the paper and I have a grey tray full of water there. The paper that I'm using is Shiramini and that comes from Origami Factory. It is the paper that comes on a roll. You can probably see that by how curved it is. This is a washi paper and these papers vary a lot. I find with the Shiramini like this that it's better to damp it on its own rather than using a damp pack to put it in. So you can see I've got it on a plastic sheet there. I'm going to damp every sheet of my printing paper and then I'm going to leave it for an hour or two on its own in that plastic sheet for the water to work its way through the paper so that everything is uniformly damp. You'll see me using a damp pack when I'm printing, but I won't be leaving these sheets of paper in the damp for any length of time. If I go off and have lunch or whatever, I will take them out of the damp pack and put them back into this sheet of plastic because I find the damp pack makes them too damp if they're left in there for any length of time. Here I'm just making sure that they're all lying flat and that there are no creases. I'm also checking that all the paper is the right way around. There is a smooth side and a slightly less smooth side to this paper, and it's the smooth side that I'm going to be printing on. Here I am cutting plastic. This is a sort of plastic film. It doesn't really matter what sort. I think this is Mylar that I'm using here. And I'm using it to protect the paper from other blocks while I'm printing. Now this isn't because I'm worried about the colour transferring from other blocks to the print. It's because I don't want to emboss the paper with other bits of the print while I'm working. So you can see there I've got several printing blocks on a single piece of wood and the plastic is just acting as a kind of padding to prevent any embossing. The brush I'm using here is made from deer hair. I prefer to use these brushes for my printmaking, but other printers use horsehair and other types of animal hair depending on what they're printing and their personal preference. Here's the damp pack, you can see. It's actually two pieces of blotting paper stitched into a sheet, a clean cotton sheet. and that's to prolong the life of the damp blotting paper. When I'm using the damp pack, it stops me tearing the blotting paper when I'm lifting it to put the print into the damp pack. This is baking parchment that I'm using just to act as a buffer between the damp printing paper and the Baron. Here's a different Baron. I have several Barons. These are the bamboo covered discs that I'm using to rub the back of the paper, and I use different ones depending on the type of block I'm working on and the amount of pressure that I want to put on the paper while I'm taking the impression. Here I'm fitting the paper into the registration, the Kento. These are two little notches cut into the wood that allow me to position the print accurately. In the foreground, this is rice paste, this is nori, and rice paste is used in conjunction with watercolour. At least I'm using watercolour here. Here I am putting the rice on. That rice is going to make the watercolour paint slippery and smooth it out across the wood so that I can get a clean print. It's crucial to making the printing process work. Without the starch paste, the paint would just either stick in the wood or give a very unsatisfactory result when it was printed. The nori is added separately from the paint so that I can control how much I'm using. I'll use different amounts of nori depending on how much I've printed, what the paint needs, the effect I'm looking for. So adding it to the paint wouldn't be helpful. Where you can see the paper landing down on the other blocks there, those blocks are dry, the paint on them's dry, and there is no transfer to the paper. Here I am again putting another sort of plastic onto the block, again to stop embossing, and you see how I'm using masking tape there. I'm making myself a pair of hinges so that I can move that flap up and down easily. This is a technique I first saw at David Bull's workshop. He makes wonderful videos for YouTube, so do be sure to check out David Bull's channel for Japanese woodblock videos. And he introduced me to this idea of using these sheets of plastic with hinges, and it's really handy. There you can see the rice paste again. I usually cook my own rice paste up just using rice flour and water. I have made a YouTube video on how I do it, if you're interested in making some yourself. Checking my hands there, very important to keep clean. The paint that I'm using here, it's watercolour, it's professional quality watercolour paint, and I use various different brands depending on the colours, but they are all good quality watercolour paints. This is the hardest block to print in the whole of the edition. It's a large flat sheet of colour, and I find this the hardest thing. It's the sky of this print. And here I am, I'm mixing a colour, and you'll see that there's a lot of toing and froing while I get the right colour. The name of this print is Rhubarb Sky, and it's really important that I get the right shade of sort of golden pink for this. The wood is a plywood, it's Sheena plywood, it's a professional grade plywood designed for this process, and it has very strong glues between the layer. You can see that the wood is sitting there soaking up water before I start printing. It's very important that the block is damp when you're printing Japanese woodblock prints, and so it's a very wet process. This Sheena plywood will withstand that damp without delaminating. You can use lots of different types of wood. The point about plywood, though, is that unlike solid wood, it won't distort when it's damped, so it doesn't sort of cup or crack or change shape, which makes it very stable. So by preference, I would use a plywood, even if that means taking a solid piece of wood and bonding it to other wood to make a ply. It's just so much easier to manage than solid wood for this process. So you can see here I'm doing a lot of testing and mixing. Some printmakers mix the whole palette of colours up before they start printing, but I tend to do it as I'm going along. can see how little paint's needed. I'm actually adding water. You saw me squirting the bottle there. Obviously I've decided that the colour's still too strong. So what I'll probably be doing, I don't know if it shows in the film, is to print this, and then if I think it needs to be stronger, I will print it again and have 2 layers that will allow me to build up the colour gradually rather than risking putting too much on in one hit. Here, the Baron that I'm using, it's not as good a Baron as the one I was using earlier, but the reason I'm using it is because it's very, very smooth. The bamboo wrapping is completely smooth, and so it's given me the best chance of getting a completely smooth impression. My better quality Baron still needs to do a bit more printing before the bamboo is worn smooth. The brush I'm using here is a horsehair brush. You can see a box in the foreground there with a cloth in it that has a little bit of oil on it so that I can oil my Baron surface occasionally to keep it smooth while I'm printing. Here I'm preparing to do a shading, a bokashi, a bleed of colour in the top of the sky. So I'm using a damp cloth to prepare the block, make sure it's got the correct level of dampness. Just turning the block round to make it easier for me to do this shading. So I'm going to put a strip of colour along the top here, and that's going to bleed from dark to invisible to give a shading up at the top. It's a thing you see a lot in Japanese landscape prints. The rice here is very important because it's going to act as a lubricant. It's going to make that paint move as I'm working with it. And if you look at the printing brush that I'm using here, can you see that it's got some masking tape on it? The reason it's got a bit of masking tape on it is so that I know which part of the brush has gone into the paint and which part hasn't, because I need the paint to be only on one half of the brush to engineer this bleed of colour. So if you watch the brush, you can see at all times some of the brush is in the paint and some of it isn't. And here I'm doing another bokashi, another shading at the base of the sky in a sort of golden yellow. can see there I've got 2 damp packs. So I've got a pack for work waiting to be printed and a pack for work that has been printed. There, you can see them both there, those 2 damp packs. And I find that really helps with my workflow. So once all the prints are printed, I flip the pack over to reverse the order that they're stacked up in and move the pack to the other position, and then I start again, so that every time that I'm printing a layer, the prints are printed in the same order. And that's so that each print gets the same amount of resting time in between printing, so that it has a chance to relax and doesn't dry out. So here I'm printing trees, and you can see I'm using different colours on blocks that are very close together. You can do that with Japanese woodblock printing. What I need to use are little tiny print brushes, and I need a separate print brush for each part of the multiple block that's a different colour. So again, here comes the rice, little tiny bits of rice on there. And you can see tiny brushes so that the colours don't get mixed up. You can see here the white spaces. These are the gaps left for the trees that I'm just about to print. Because I'm using watercolour, I can't just layer paint colours one on top of the others. It's not like my lino cuts, which are made up of layers of ink printed one on top of the other. With Japanese woodblock printing, I want the colours, the different coloured blocks to be separate, because like a watercolour, I want the colour of the paper to shine through and add brilliance to the print. And the colours in the paint pots are much brighter or darker, more distinct than they will be in the print, because remember, when they go on the block, they're going to be diluted by the rice paste. And also it's a very, very thin layer of paint. I'm really not using much paint at all. So they look a lot punchier in the mixing jar than they do once they're spread out on the block. So throughout this video, you might have noticed it sounds like I've got a grandfather clock in the studio. I wish I did have, but I don't. That is a pile driver. They are reinstating the railway in our town, and they are building the station platforms at the moment. So we've been listening to the pile driver for about 3 weeks as they make the supports for the platform and the new station that they're building. These brushes that I'm using to apply the paint with before I use the printing brushes, I buy these in sort of bulk at art shows where there are suppliers, anywhere that little paint brushes are being sold cheaply, and then I chop the ends off so that they don't knock the paint pots over. You can see them all there with their chopped off ends. So I'm not a painter, so I don't actually use those brushes for making paintings at all. They are just there to mix colours and put the colours onto the woodblock. Here I'm just checking that I can get the paper into the registration slots with that plastic sheet in the way. So here I'm printing the last and the darkest block. This is the fine line detail on the trees and a tiny little flock of birds. And here I'm using a mixture of watercolour paint and sumi ink, black sumi ink, to get the fine details right. And I've really got one hit at doing this for each print. I don't like double printing fine detail because it gets clumsy. So I'm being very careful about how much ink I put on. And the brush I'm using is horsehair, but it's the winter coat of a horse, not mane or tail hair. So it's a very soft, dense brush. And that's going to allow me to catch all that little detail without flooding it. So I use different types of printing brushes for different parts of the block. And here I'm just checking to see that everything is all right. And this is my finished print. So this is Rhubarb Sky Hawnby, and you can see the little flock of birds there as well. So if you've enjoyed this film, don't forget to subscribe to my channel. We'll be making some more films shortly, and there are also useful playlists on Japanese woodblock printing and lino cut.